In this video, we are going to look at the additive property of equality with a negative coefficient. And so that's just a lot of fancy terms going on. And so we're just still looking at solving equations. That's the important part. But our equations this time we're kind of building them up a little bit. So we're getting to equations that are slightly harder. And so for these, they might look like the following. So maybe I had negative x plus 50 equals 163. Okay, so I've got a couple things going on in my problem. So one of the things going on is I have this negative with my x. The other thing that's going on is I have this plus 50. When I'm trying to solve an equation, the very first thing I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get the x all by itself. So the first thing I'm going to do is this plus 50 is kind of in the way. So I'm going to, just like we did before, move the plus 50 to the other side. The way that I'm going to do that is I'm going to subtract 50 from both sides because it was a positive 50 and I was adding 50. So I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to subtract 50. And so if I do that, the positive 50 and the minus 50 cancel each other out. On the left-hand side, I'm left with negative x. And on the right-hand side, I now have 163 minus 50, which is 113. And so now I'm in a position, I'm looking better. My x is closer to being alone, but it's still not completely alone because of this negative. And the thing I want to think about here is, so remember, we can think of this as x is being multiplied by negative 1. And remember, we talked about how do you get rid of something being multiplied? You divide. So I'm going to divide both sides of my equation here by negative 1. So on the left-hand side, it's going to cancel out, and I'm just going to be left with x. And on the right-hand side, 113 divided by negative 1 is negative 113. So these equations kind of take two steps, and most equations, actually, I should say when you're solving them, take more than one step. All those other problems we did, those were all kind of one-step equations, and they were just to get us ready for these more complicated equations. So let's look at another example. Here I have 171 is equal to 94 minus x. So again, I want to get x by itself. There's this minus sign, there's this 94. Both of them somehow have to go away. So I'm going to deal with the 94 first. So I want to take the 94, I want to move it to the other side. Notice it's a positive 94, which means I'm going to subtract 94 from both sides of the equation. So if I subtract 94 from both sides of the equation, on the right-hand side, it's going to go away. I still have that negative with my x, so be sure to keep that negative. I didn't do anything to get rid of that negative yet. And then 171 minus 94 is actually 77. And so now I have this minus x. So just like before, right? Remember, it's just like a minus 1. So we're going to divide both sides by minus 1. So our minus 1s are going to cancel. X is going to end up being negative 77. And just like before, right, remember you can check your answers. So I can check that 171, is that actually equal to 94 minus negative 77? And so remember 94 minus 77, that's the same as 94 plus 77, and that is in fact 171. So we'll try one more here for good measure. Let me find a good problem. Okay, so what about negative 160 minus x equals 90? Okay, so again, I've got this negative 160, I've got this negative sign in front of x. I want to get the x all alone. So I'm going to first deal with this negative 160, right? It's hanging out here all by itself. I want to move it to the other side. Since it was a negative 160, I'm going to add 160 to both sides. So if I do that, they cancel. I'm left with negative x on the left-hand side, and then 160 plus 90 is 250. And then I still have this negative that's attached to the x. So just like before, I can think of it as a negative 1. I can divide both sides by negative 1. So those would cancel out. And I'm left with x is equal to negative 250. So equations aren't too bad as long as you can figure out what steps to do first. So the important thing to notice is that these numbers that were kind of hanging out all by themselves along with the x, the first thing I did was get rid of them and move this 94 to the other side. I moved this 50 to the other side. I moved this negative 160 to the other side. So that's kind of a very good first step. And then worry about what you have left. And in all these cases, what I had left was a negative 1 times x. So I divided in each case by negative 1.